online. Hello, everybody. And I'm going to get started. My goal today is to not have as many ums in my presentation, which I never realize I'm doing until I record something and then play it back. How many suffer from that?
I don't.
I'm glad I'm not alone. Oops. Let me share my screen. All right, if you're just tuning in, we are going to be talking about balance and rhythm today. We're going to start off with balance. I'm going to get rid of my Photoshop book and make this big. All right, so these two chapters that we're talking about today do wrap up the design principles section or portion of the book. So next week, you'll have a quiz on everything in this first section. And everything that's on the quiz will be coming from the PDFs that I've posted and these lectures that I'm using. So you should have study guides. You can go back and download any of them that you didn't get, but everything is straight from the book. So if you have the book, you're in great shape. If you're not using the book, just download the PDFs and go over those, and you should be in good shape. Okay, am I the only one who's seeing the small strip of our faces on the right? In other words, can you on yours?
I don't have everybody else's faces, just yours.
Okay, so you can see the picture of the umbrellas and the rain, correct?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Okay, good. I just want to make sure that on my screen, the little drop down with all of our faces obscures a little bit of that picture, and I just want to make sure that it doesn't obscure it for you. So balance is an important part of composition, and in this first picture, initially, you might think, oh, this picture is out of balance because there's a lot of activity on the right-hand side and very little going on in the lower left. However, the artist has been able to keep this balanced by using directional line. We haven't talked much about line yet, but we're going to in the future. So, although there's this big swath of activity that comes from the upper left and goes to the lower right, there's also a lot of directional lines that form sort of an X in the opposite direction and help keep this particular composition balanced. As we'll talk about later, it's harder than you think to achieve this type of balance. We can define balance as the distribution of visual weight in a composition. And we're all very familiar with balance. When we're small and we're learning to walk, we know what it's like to be off balance. And we instinctively seek balance in our lives and what we're looking at. When we're talking about pictorial balance, which is visual balance, we refer often to an axis. So the axis is a line of reference around which a form or composition is balanced. And normally that axis is vertical, although it can be horizontal. When you have equilibrium or a balanced composition, you have equal weight between the opposing compositional elements on either side of that axis, whether it is vertical or horizontal. So we say that when that happens, an image appears or feels balanced. When it's lacking balance, that's when we feel a bit uncomfortable. We know what it's like to be off balance in our lives. So when we see something that isn't balanced, it elicits this emotion of instability or maybe a little bit of uncomfortable feeling or dissatisfaction. In this example, we see a lot of really heavy elements that are off center, so they're more weighted towards the right, and they're up above the horizon line, which tends to make us really uncomfortable. Heavy things are not supposed to be, too far above us unless they're here and gone like a plane. But if you look at the title of this piece, which is called Transitions, you start to get a clue about why those big forms are up and to the right. Everything is pointing towards this feeling of being off balance, and you're going through a transition. So the artist has used that uncomfortable sense that we get when something isn't balanced to elicit a certain response in us. Most of the time, designers especially are trying to achieve balance, but you can use imbalance very effectively if you're creating an advertisement, especially if you're working in social justice or something where you want to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable when they're looking at your work. It creates a little bit of tension. When you have things more weighted towards the bottom, that creates a feeling of stability and calmness. When you end up with more on top, it's more dynamic, but it also feels more unstable. When you're designing things, try to keep this in mind. Even this week with your texture, you can use this sense of balance or imbalance to help convey the word that you're expressing with your texture. There are 4 types of balance, and we're going to talk briefly about each one. Symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, radial balance, and crystallographic balance, or all over. First, we have symmetrical balance. This is a very fun thing to do with Photoshop. Take a photo of yourself straight on, as we have here with Audrey Hepburn on the left, and then mask or just divide your face in half and move that half to another layer or hide it with a mask. Take the remaining half, duplicate it, and flip it over horizontally. And then you'll position those, and you'll see what you will look like if your features were perfectly symmetrical. Very few people have that sort of symmetry, and as you can see here, Audrey Hepburn had it, and that's part of the reason she's considered one of the all-time iconic beauties, is because symmetry is relatively rare. Even though we look quite a bit alike from left to right, we're not exactly the same. Most of us have one side that you like to have photographed a little more than the other. But if you have time, try this out and see what you look like. This is the simplest kind of balance to recognize, and it's also known as bilateral symmetry. So there are 2, the word bi, lateral means side to side. The same shapes are repeated on the left and the right side of the axis. This is also known as formal balance. So you'll see bilateral symmetry or symmetrical balance in a lot of government buildings and churches because it makes you feel calm. It makes you feel grounded. It creates a feeling of strength and permanence and stability. So go into any cathedral. If you go into our capital in Sacramento, you'll see very symmetrical balance, formal type of balance. It unifies, and it's used quite often in architecture. Here's an example of an artist who did just what we did with Audrey Hepburn's portrait, only he did it with a mountain. And this is Ed Rushka. He flipped a scene of a mountain over a vertical axis. And then he also created, and I always have to look at this word, a palindrome. My granddaughter's name is a palindrome, Hannah, which is the visual equivalent. You can read it the same from right to left as left to right. So this was just created to make a statement about symmetry or to create something that looks like nature on first glance, but on second glance, obviously, is not found in nature. You'll find a lot of symmetry in nature. Again, when you leave here or next time you go outside, just look around, look for examples of symmetry or asymmetry. We relate often everything to our own human body and the vertical axis that runs through it. And in that picture, symmetry is the emphasis of that print. The second type of balance is asymmetrical balance. That's where you have things that are equal weight across that vertical axis, but they're not the same. And here's a great example of that. You have a composition here, a sculpture, that is balanced, but nowhere near the same. And the artist has used things like contrasting colors and value and size to create this very lively sculpture that is balanced, but not perfectly, like we just saw. This is also known a lot of times as informal balance. It is much harder to achieve for the artist. And it's funny because it looks really casual, but it's a little more of an effort to create. And you can define this by saying that dissimilar objects that are not the same, can have a visual weight or eye attraction. The big red boxes are balanced by the solid black pictures because normally black attracts the eye and creates more of an impact. We'll see that again a little bit later. So here's a photograph with asymmetrical balance. And when you look at this, you can see that it's not centered. It's not the same on either side of that vertical axis, but it's definitely balanced. We see the gaze of the eye, we engage in that, but then almost immediately, our eye is drawn to the hand and the cigarette, which seems to be pointing up in a different direction. As I said, this is also known as informal balance, and it is harder to create. If you can create something that is asymmetrical, it will give your piece a little less rigid look to it or feel to it, and a little bit more of a casual feel. So again, think of these things when you're working on your own work or as you move forward and you work on a client's work. Do they want something more formal? Do they want to express more stability and weight, or is this a casual, more lighthearted message that you're trying to get across? There are some different ways to achieve asymmetrical balance. This first one is with value. As you probably read in the book, even though the right-hand square is much larger than the left-hand square, our eye is drawn to the small black square because of the high contrast of that black on white, and because dark colors like this tend to just grab our eye. So this is balanced by value. You can also use the same principle in color. Some colors are going to have more weight than others. We'll look at balance by texture and pattern next. And then finally, we'll look at balance by position and eye direction. Here's another example of balance by value or color. This one is using both. So you have that strong yellow, a lot of detail, a lot of action, a lot happening on the left, but this big block of yellow. So your eye goes back and forth, following the directional lines in here, but keeps bouncing back and forth. So even though it's definitely not perfectly balanced, not formal, it's asymmetrically balanced. There's a lot of contrast between light and dark, creating value. And if you keep in mind that you can balance a large area of dark with a bright color, or conversely, what we saw in that earlier one, a large area of not so bright color or texture with a small, darker color. And our eyes are attracted to color, and then they'll look at black and white. When you're doing this kind of composition or trying to achieve this sort of balance, you want to think about the area between the contours of a shape. And I know we haven't talked about shape and contour and line yet, but we'll start in on that next week. But as you can see in this one, sometimes there are areas that might be considered negative space, but they are rendered in a really dark color, so they become more important in this particular composition than negative space or just background. And if you learn to balance with value and color, you're achieving a great tool at you've got a great tool at your disposal, and you can do a lot with it in your designs. You can also achieve asymmetrical balance by texture and pattern. This is in your book also. The top one, because that small area has a lot more going on, it's a sort of an organic, crazy shape. Even though it has the same texture as that rectangle on the left, our eye is drawn to that shape on the right. On the bottom one, you can see that there's a really large rectangle, kind of flat color, but then there's a small square. And that square draws our eye because it has more texture. Getting hung up here. So you can think of all the different ways that you could use this. There's almost an infinite variety. You can balance a large shape by a smaller textured shape. You can use texture alone. You could use shape alone. And if you have a lot of texture, you can balance that by a more complex shape. So as you can see, there's just lots of different variations there. Here's a woodcut, a Japanese woodcut that is a great example of this. And it shows the really large red mass, on the lower right, that is balanced out by all the texture in the sky to the left. And there's also at play here, we haven't talked about color, but there are complementary colors at play. and a lot of different texture happening on the left and kind of the left bottom of that picture. Here they have water. I saw this as trees. Maybe it's ambiguous. Interpret that lower left as you like. Third, we have achieving balance by position and eye direction. This is a little more subtle than the previous ways. So you've all seen a teeter-totter or a seesaw like this, and you've probably all taken some sort of physics class where if you want to balance two objects of different weights, you have to put the larger one closer to the center. That is positioning something to achieve visual balance. And you can see that in this example here. Bless you. In this one, it's very subtle, and it looks like it's weighted very heavily to the left. But what keeps this balanced asymmetrically are the curves, which draw you from the angel on the left over to the right, and the direction of the eye gaze. So the angel and the person on the right are exchanging. There's a direct line between their eyes, and that keeps pulling your eye over to the right and down and keeps this balanced. This one is an interesting photo using asymmetrical technique, and I won't go through the whole thing. There's a really great discussion of it in your book. But basically, it's very balanced, but it's not the same. The white car is balanced by the blue picnic table and shade. You've got the three figures on the right that are balanced by the one figure and the open door of the car on the left. And then across the sky, you have about an equal amount of clouds, but they're all different shapes and intensities, except for the very center where it's kind of weighted there. So it's a really good example of, it almost doesn't look like a photo, it almost looks like a print, but they tell us in the book that it is, yep, it is a photo. Also remember that we talk about all of these things separately, but in reality, you often use more than one method to achieve balance, more than one method to achieve many of your goals in your compositions. The third type of balance is radial balance. We see this a lot in nature. If you went out of your house, I bet it wouldn't take you 5 minutes before you saw an example of radial balance. And that's when all the elements radiate out from a central point. It's very common, as we said. It's often seen in jewelry and ceramics. Makes sense because especially if you're using a potter's wheel, you're creating things that rotate, so you get you get a lot of radial symmetry there. It's also used a lot in churches and government buildings. Again, if you go to Sacramento, you look up in the center of our Capitol building, you see radial symmetry. You see it a lot in stained glass windows and other types of art like Tibetan mandalas. The last type of pattern that we'll look at, or balance, is an all-over pattern, where the entire whole is as important, if not more important, than the individual elements. So you get balance with an equal emphasis over the whole format. It's also called all-over pattern or crystallographic balance, if you want to impress your friends at your next cocktail party. And that's balance. I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute. Any questions, comments, things that you learned that you want to share with the rest of the class anything at all about balance?
What's it called when you like kind of take something off the page? That would be
Oh, like when you dress up and you're supposed to look in the mirror and take one thing off?
no. You create and it's kind of off the page a little bit, like
if it's sticking off the page,
uh-huh.
that creates a little bit of a tension because the eye wants to follow it off the page. So that can create a little bit of imbalance. It doesn't necessarily make it imbalanced. You could conceivably have a very balanced composition, but have things going off the edge of the page. But generally speaking, you have to be super careful with that because someone's eye might roll right off and onto the next thing.
So you have to put something in the to bring them back in, right?
Right. Generally, you want to employ some kind of method to keep them engaged in your painting and not fly off. But that doesn't mean, like, if you have a geometric painting going on or a composition, that you can't have things coming in from the side and the top and the bottom. Just be careful that you're not inadvertently creating a line that just leads people right off the side. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share screen again and go on to rhythm. This is a very short chapter in the book, and I don't think it will take us long to go through. When artists employ rhythm, they're oftentimes trying to elicit a body response from the viewers, and that is called kinesthetic empathy. So when you look at a piece of art and it stimulates another sense, then that is called kinesthetic art or kinesthetic empathy. In this example here, the artist has tried to invoke a memory of cicadas making noise on a hot summer night.
Whoa.
So in order to do that, he has created a lot of, there are geometric forms that repeat, like the triangles down near the bottom, kind of jaggedy lines, and more curvy, organic lines and shapes that repeat in those bushes in the middle ground, and even some kind of kinetic lines and shapes that are going off and up into the sky. So this is a kind of a specific type of, people who try to interpret sounds in a visual medium often use rhythm in their art. So it is a design principle that is based on repetition. Oftentimes you'll see rhythm that is based on the same element that are only slightly modified, as in this example. This example is a great one of rhythm because it not only uses the curvy lines and the shapes that get wider and thinner as they undulate, but it also uses color to kind of excite our brain. And when you look at this picture, you actually can see it moving. It seems to undulate. The rhythm in music, it's a beat or a flow, and it's the same in art. It's a beat or a flow of images that is going to invoke in you that feeling, that sense that you're hearing, that feeling that you get when you hear something that's very rhythmic. You can see it in patterns like we just saw in the slide before this, but you can also see it in nature, as in this photograph. There we have an undulating rhythm, but it's a little less flowy. It's a little more jerky because there are sharper angles here. You can create rhythm in photography, in painting, in almost any kind of art form. And oftentimes we see it just in repeating shapes, but you can also talk about it in terms of color and texture. In this photograph of Death Valley, we see these undulating forms, light going to dark. There's high contrast between the light and the dark, but there's also areas where it just blends seamlessly, light to dark. And then within the larger forms, there's even smaller forms of repeating elements that kind of have the rhythm that you might get from wind. When you talk about rhythm in a piece, you may or may not want to use these musical terms like legato. I'm not a musician, so that doesn't come very naturally to me, but you may feel very comfortable talking about these terms that are in your book. This chair design has a rhythm that's very different from the photograph we just saw because it's very crisp. There's a lot of rhythm in those vertical lines, but there's also rhythm in the squares and in the curve of that chair's back. You can create alternating rhythm. This is a very interesting piece because the more you look at it, the more it changes. It not only bounces and moves, but it changes direction, almost like a 3D cubes. We're very familiar with rhythm in nature. We live it. We have a rhythm to our days. Night becomes morning. The sun rises and sets. The planets continue to rotate. We have seasons that change. We have tides that come in and go out. So we understand rhythm on a really intuitive manner or intuitive way. This is another example of the vibrating colors. We saw that earlier with the vertical piece at the very beginning of this section. And these are colors that are almost complementary on the color wheel, and they create a little bit of a disturbance in your retina, which creates a vibration. So as you look at this pink and orange balls against the blue background, they almost seem to move. And how many of you can see that the cubes sometimes face right, but the longer you look at it, sometimes they switch and move and turn to the other direction and face left and upwards. It's a really fun piece. And a lot of times we take these for granted, but I like to appreciate the artists that put this together. We see alternating rhythm quite a bit in architecture as well. So in buildings with columns, this is a section of I think it was a Greek building, and you can see that the alternating light in the dark towards the top, but you can also see the alternating X's and O's down near the bottom. We're also very intuitively familiar with progressive rhythm, which are converging patterns. We see it a lot in nature also. Anything from a nautilus shell to lots of different plants. So this is a type of rhythm where the repetition of a shape changes in a very regular manner. You can see that in Edward Weston's photograph of the half of an artichoke. Those shapes are changing, but it's very almost predictable and regular. Can also include color, value, and texture. And that concludes our rhythm chapter. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.